The morning Theodora Vance arrived at Kessler House, the front gate was rusted open at an angle that suggested it had not moved in years. She did not ask the driver to wait. She stepped down from the hired carriage with one trunk, one hatbox, and the folded marriage certificate she had signed 6 days ago in her father's study, while her mother stood near the window and did not look at her. The certificate was tucked inside her coat, close to her ribs, not for sentiment. For proof, if anyone at the house should question her right to be there. No one came to meet her. The housekeeper, a compact woman in her 50s named Mrs. Pruitt, appeared at the door only after Theodora had already crossed the gravel path and climbed the porch steps herself. Mrs. Pruitt took in the single trunk, the young woman holding her own hatbox, and the absence of a husband, and her expression arranged itself into something between sympathy and caution. "Mrs. Kessler," she said. It was the first time anyone had called Theodora that. She had not decided yet whether she would correct it. "Mrs. Pruitt," Theodora said, "I'd like to see the household accounts before supper if you can have them ready." Mrs. Pruitt blinked. "The accounts, yes, and a list of current staff, their wages, and which positions are vacant." Theodora stepped past her into the hall. The smell hit her first, dust and cold air and the faint sweetness of woodwork left unpolished too long. The chandelier above her was magnificent and dark, half its candles missing. A console table along the left wall held a ceramic bowl of dried flowers so old the petals had turned to powder. "I'll need to understand what I've been given before I can decide what to do with it." Mrs. Pruitt followed her inside and closed the door. "Mr. Kessler gave no instruction about." "Mr. Kessler is in Philadelphia," Theodora said. She turned to face the housekeeper. "And I am here." She had met Renwick Kessler exactly 4 times before she married him. The first time was at the Hartfield dinner in March, where he stood near the fireplace and spoke to no one, and left before dessert was served. The second was at her cousin's garden party, where someone introduced them, and he shook her hand with the attention of a man signing a ledger entry, and moved on. The third was at her father's house, when her father had invited him to discuss what her father called an arrangement, and what her mother, afterward, called an opportunity. Renwick had sat across the parlor from Theodora for 40 minutes. He answered her father's questions. He asked her none. The 4th time was their wedding. It had been a small affair. Her parents, her 2 younger sisters, an aunt from Connecticut, and a handful of Renwick's associates, whose names she did not catch. Renwick had arrived on time, stood beside her at the front of the room, repeated what the minister said, and signed the register. He did not kiss her. He shook her father's hand. He said quietly to Theodora, "The house is in Greenvale. Mrs. Pruitt will help you settle in. I have business in Philadelphia that cannot wait." Then he left. Her mother had put a hand on her arm and said nothing at all, which was the kindest thing she could have done. On the train to Greenvale, Theodora had sat with her trunk in the luggage car, and her hatbox on the seat beside her, and looked out at the passing countryside and thought, "All right, then I will treat this like a problem to be solved." She was 24 years old, and she had kept her father's books since she was 16. She knew what an asset looked like. She knew what a liability looked like. She was fairly certain she could tell the difference between a house that was merely neglected and a house that was actually broken. Kessler House, she decided by the end of her first evening, was both. The accounts Mrs. Pruitt produced were 3 years out of date. Theodora sat at the desk in what had been Renwick's study, a room he apparently used once a year at most, judging by the layer of dust on the window ledge, and spread the ledgers across the surface and began to read. Mrs. Pruitt brought her tea and stood in the doorway with the expression of someone watching a person walk into traffic. "The estate has been managed by Carver and Locke," Mrs. Pruitt said, "since Mr. Kessler's father passed. They handle the tenant rents, the timber leases, How long has it been since anyone here saw an itemized statement from them?" Silence. "Mrs. Pruitt, I wouldn't know, ma'am. I handle the house, not the land." Theodora turned a page. The numbers were not adding up, and not in the small ordinary way of careless bookkeeping. They were not adding up in the deliberate way of figures that had been arranged to resist examination. She had seen that before, in her father's business, when a supplier had been skimming freight costs for 2 years before she caught it. She finished her tea. She started a second ledger. Outside, the night came in off the Connecticut hills, and the house settled around her with the sounds of old wood and cold pipes. And Theodora worked until the candle had burned to a stub, and her handwriting in her own notebook had grown small and precise and damning. She went to bed at midnight. She was back at the desk by 6. It took her 9 days to build a complete picture. In those 9 days, she mapped every acre of the Kessler land, using the original survey documents she found in a locked cabinet in the study. The key was on a hook behind the door. No one had thought to hide it. She cross-referenced the tenant rolls against the actual letters of tenancy. She wrote to the county assessor's office requesting the last 5 years of property tax filings. She went through the timber lease agreements line by line and found, buried in a renewal clause dated 4 years ago, a provision that allowed Carver and Locke to retain 15% of gross timber revenue as a management facilitation fee, a phrase that appeared nowhere in the original contract signed by Renwick's father. 15% of gross, not net, gross. She set the page down and sat with that number for a long moment. Then she picked up her pen and wrote a letter to Carver and Locke. It was a brief letter, polite. She introduced herself as Mrs. Kessler, expressed interest in understanding the estate's financial position, and requested complete statements for the past 6 years. Receipts, disbursements, the management fee calculations, and the names of every party to whom payments had been made. She signed it with her full name, folded it, and gave it to the boy who ran errands for Mrs. Pruitt to post that afternoon. She did not tell anyone what she had found. Not yet. There was a part of Theodora that had been trained, by years of watching her father navigate business, and her mother navigate everything else, to keep her cards face down until she was sure. Being right was not enough. Being right in a way that could be refuted was worse than saying nothing. She needed documents. She needed signatures. She needed the kind of evidence that a man in a boardroom would not be able to wave away with the word misunderstanding. While she waited for the response from Carver and Locke, she turned her attention to the house. Not because she had been told to, because it was hers now, in whatever incomplete, unasked-for way, and she was not going to live in a house that smelled like a museum of someone else's grief. She spoke to Mrs. Pruitt about the staff. There were 4. Mrs. Pruitt herself, a cook named Alma, a stableman named Hector, and a girl of 15 called Betts who did a little of everything and was paid almost nothing. There had once been 8 staff, Mrs. Pruitt told her. They had left, one by one, when the wages came late. 3 of those positions were still listed in the household accounts as active, with salaries being drawn. Theodora wrote that down too. She ordered the ground floor rooms aired. She found Holland covers in a cedar closet and had Betts help her uncover the furniture in the sitting room and the dining room and the front parlor. She went through the kitchen with Alma and made a list of what was needed. She wrote out a household budget on a single sheet of paper, showed it to Mrs. Pruitt, and asked if there was anything she'd missed. Mrs. Pruitt looked at the sheet for a long time. "No," she said at last. "Nothing missed." She paused. "He hasn't had anyone do that, not since his mother was alive. When did she die? 7 years ago. Just before his first marriage." Theodora kept her expression even. "He was married before." Mrs. Kessler, the first, passed 2 years ago. It was a difficult time. Mrs. Pruitt looked at her hands. "He hasn't been much here since." Theodora thought about the man who had left his own wedding reception with a handshake. The man who had not asked her a single question in 40 minutes. The man who apparently found it easier to hand his house over to a stranger than to spend one extra night in it himself. "What happened to you?" she thought. "That made you so careful not to let anything matter." She didn't say it. She went back to the study and opened the next ledger. Carver and Locke did not respond to her letter. They responded, instead, to Renwick. She found out because Renwick's letter arrived on the same morning as a terse note from a man named Mr. Aldous Carver, who addressed her as Dear Madam and suggested, in language so smooth it nearly slid off the page, that matters of estate management were complex and specialized, and that any questions she had would be most effectively addressed through the proper channel of Mr. Kessler's direct communication. In other words, go away. Renwick's letter was 2 paragraphs. He hoped she had settled in comfortably. He anticipated returning to Greenvale in approximately 3 weeks. He noted that Carver and Locke had been in contact with him and asked that she direct any household questions to Mrs. Pruitt. Household questions. Theodora set the letter on the desk and looked at it for a moment. She was not angry. She had been angry at 17, when the first supplier had cheated her father, and her father had taken 3 months to believe her, and the anger had been hot and exhausting and had not helped anything. What she felt now was something colder and more useful. The clarity that comes when someone has confirmed exactly what they are. She wrote back to Renwick. It was not the letter she might have written at 17. It was not accusatory. It was not emotional. It was 6 paragraphs of methodical, documented findings, each one sourced to a specific document, a specific page, a specific line. The unauthorized management fee, the 3 ghost wages still being drawn from the household account. The timber lease renewal clause that had no equivalent in the original contract, the 6-year gap in detailed statements, and at the end, a single sentence. I am writing to you as your wife and as the person currently responsible for this house, to give you the information I believe you have been denied. What you do with it is, of course, your decision. She posted it herself. He arrived in 11 days, not 3 weeks. She did not know he was coming. She was in the back garden when he arrived, on her knees in the first bed she'd had Hector dig out, separating the tangled roots of what she thought might be an old rose that had been left too long without cutting back. Her hands were in heavy gloves, and her dress was the old brown one she'd begun to think of as her working dress, and her hair was entirely wrong. She heard the carriage on the drive. She stood up, pulled off one glove, and shaded her eyes against the October light. Renwick Kessler crossed the garden toward her. He was taller than she remembered, or the garden made him seem so. He had traveled through the night, probably. His coat was creased and his hat was not quite level, and he had the look of a man whose plans had been interrupted by a conscience. He stopped a few feet away. You found all of it, he said. It was not a question. Yes, Theodora said. He looked at the garden bed she'd been working, at the clipped path along the stone wall, at the rose canes she'd bundled and set aside. Then he looked at her. How long did it take you? 9 days to document. I had moved through his expression. Not quite guilt, not quite admiration, something between them that didn't have a ready name. He looked at the house behind her, at the windows, which were clean now, and which had light in them. Carver told me you were overstepping, he said. Yes, I expect he did. He's been managing this estate for 11 years. He's been billing this estate for 11 years, Theodora said. Whether he's been managing it is a different question. Renwick was quiet. A crow called somewhere over the back wall. The wind came off the hills and moved through the garden and carried with it the smell of cold earth and the faint wood smoke from Alma's kitchen, and Theodora waited without anxiety, because she had already decided that she had done the right thing regardless of what happened next. I owe you an apology, Renwick said at last. You owe me an explanation, she said. The apology can come after, if you feel you still need to give it. He looked at her then, really looked at her, in a way he had not done once in the 4 times they had met before, and said, Would you come inside? There are things I should have told you before the wedding. Yes, she said. She pulled off her other glove. There are things I should have asked. His first wife had been named Cecilia. He said it simply, without the careful vagueness that people used when they were protecting something or avoiding it. Cecilia. She had died of a fever in the 2nd year of their marriage. She had been 26. He had been with her at the end, and she had been afraid, and there was nothing he could do, and afterward the house had stopped feeling like a place he could be, without feeling the shape of her absence in every room. He had stopped coming back. He had let Carver and Locke run things, because thinking about the estate meant thinking about the plans he and Cecilia had made. The garden she had wanted to restore, the east wing she had wanted to open up, the tenant relations she had thought were neglected. And then his father had died, and the debts had mounted, and the family lawyer had told him that he needed either to sell or to secure the estate's income, and securing the estate's income meant marrying someone whose family had money or connections or both. He did not say I did not want to marry again. He didn't have to. I understand, Theodora said. You shouldn't have to understand. You should have been told. Yes. She looked at the fire, but I was also not a person in that transaction. I was a solution to a problem. And my father, I won't pretend I didn't know that. She paused. I just thought I might be useful enough to make it work. Renwick looked at her. You found a 6-year fraud in 9 days, he said. And then you wrote me the most precise letter I have ever received in my life. And then you went back to the garden. The rose wasn't going to wait, Theodora said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, and it was so unexpected that she almost didn't recognize it, he laughed. A short, unused sound, like a door opened in a room that had been shut too long. I need to deal with Carver and Locke, he said. I know. I've prepared a summary for your attorney. It's on the desk. He shook his head slowly, and she could not tell what it meant, and she decided she did not need to know yet. The legal matter took 4 months. Carver and Locke contested it, of course. Aldous Carver wrote a long letter to Renwick's attorney about the complexity of estate management and the difficulty of understanding accounts without professional training. He made a particular point of the word amateur. Theodora read the letter when Renwick showed it to her, and noted the specific passages, and then spent 2 evenings producing a rebuttal document in which every claim Carver made was answered with a specific citation from the estate records, records that bore his own firm's letterhead. The attorney, a dry-humored man named Mr. Pennington, read her document and said, Mrs. Kessler, have you considered a career in law? They don't let women practice, Theodora said. Otherwise I might. Mr. Pennington looked at her over his glasses. No, he said thoughtfully. I suppose they don't. Carver and Locke settled in March. The recovered funds were not everything that had been taken, but they were substantial enough. Renwick used a portion to clear the remaining estate debts. He used another portion to raise the wages of the staff who had left, and to bring 3 of them back. He consulted Theodora on the tenant agreements. He asked her to look at the timber lease before he signed the new one. He did not ask her in the manner of a man asking a favor. He asked her in the manner of a man who had come to understand that she would notice things he would not, and had decided this was an asset rather than an affront. She began to understand, slowly, that this was his particular way of showing something he did not yet know how to say directly. In April, the rose bloomed. She had not been entirely certain it would. She had cut it back hard in October, and it had looked for a long time like nothing more than a tangle of old wood, and Mrs. Pruitt had come out in November to look at it and said carefully that the late Mrs. Kessler had planted that rose the first spring she was here, and Theodora had said, "Then I'll do my best with it," and gone on. But in April, in the corner of the back garden, it came in with small yellow blooms and a scent that carried all the way to the kitchen window when the wind was right. Renwick found her standing in front of it one morning when he came down early. He had been coming down earlier lately, in general, and the study had started to have the look of a room in use. He stood next to her and looked at the rose and said nothing for long enough that a more anxious person might have worried about it. Theodora was not an anxious person. She would have liked to see it, he said at last. I think so, Theodora said. He was quiet. Then, I think she would have liked you. It was not a romantic declaration. It was not what a novelist would have written, but Theodora understood what it cost him to say it, because she understood by now how carefully he rationed the things that mattered, how long he held things before he let himself put them into words. She said, I'll take that as a considerable compliment. He turned to look at her. She met his gaze without looking away. He was still learning that about her, that she would not look away, that she did not perform uncertainty she did not feel, and she could see him adding it, slowly, to the catalogue of things he knew about his wife. I have been, he said, a very poor husband. You have been an absent one, she said. Those are not always the same thing, Theodora. Renwick. He looked at her long enough that it became something different from just looking. Then he offered her his arm, the way one might offer it to a person they were choosing, not merely accounting for, and said, Come inside, I'll have Alma make breakfast. She took his arm. The garden was yellow and green and entirely alive around them. The house, as they crossed back to it, had the look of a place that had been waiting, not for rescue, not for restoration, but for someone to take it seriously enough to stay. She had stayed. And somehow, without either of them quite planning it, so had he.